On the night of July 3, 2026, an 18-year-old named Nolan Wells cooked salmon for his family, hugged his mother goodbye, and walked out the front door. By the morning of July 6th, his body had been found floating in the waters off a remote barrier island on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. He had been in that water for approximately 2 days. He was 18 years old. He was a football player. He was somebody's son. And the question of what happened to him in the hours between those two moments, between the hug goodbye and the body in the water, has not been answered.
Something to read. The United Cajun Navy has completed a 22-page analytical report where they examined photographs, videos, boat locations, coordinates, and social media statements in connection with Nolan Wells' disappearance. They provided that report to TMZ, and I have never run to read something so fast in my life. But I read the entire report. I've got the gist. We're going to break it down. Let's begin. For starters, the United Cajun Navy is a volunteer search and rescue organization that responds to natural disasters and missing person cases across the country. Following Nolan's disappearance, members of the organization reviewed photographs, videos, GPS coordinates, maps, and publicly available statements to reconstruct the timeline of what happened at Horn Island on July 4th. The result is this 22-page analytical report dated July 31st, 2026, titled Geospatial Timeline and Vessel Movement Analysis. Right away, the report lays out the question investigators were trying to answer. At what time did the key events happen? Which boats were present? Which boats moved? When did they move? Who was aboard them? When did the Triton begin taking on water? And finally, what happened between Nolan's last independently corroborated sighting and the reported 4:31 departure of the boat he arrived on? Those questions become the framework for everything that follows. Then they outline how the evidence was organized. Before comparing photographs or building a timeline, the analysts organized the evidence into 4 categories. The first category includes things that can actually be seen in a photograph or video, like the boats, the shoreline, and where everything is positioned. The second category includes labels that were added to the images. Throughout the report, you'll see names like Boat Number 1, Boat X, Triton, and Palm Beach. Those labels allow investigators to follow the same boats from one photograph to the next. The third category is made up of documentary evidence, including emails, maps, and screenshots of social media posts. And the fourth category is analytical inference, where investigators compare multiple pieces of evidence to see whether they support the same conclusion. The first major finding focuses on a GPS location connected to the search. The report references a coordinate provided through the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. Investigators compared that coordinate with another map pin that had been submitted during the investigation. When they measured the distance between the two locations, they found they were only about 1.6 meters apart, roughly 5 feet. The report also references a second coordinate approximately 279 meters away, but doesn't identify what event that second location represents. With the search location established, investigators begin identifying the boats that appear throughout the photographs. To keep everything organized, they assigned each vessel a consistent label. Boat Number 1, Boat X, Boat Number 2, Boat Number 3, Palm Beach, and Triton. Throughout the report, those same labels appear again and again, allowing investigators to compare where each boat appears in one photograph versus another and document changes over time. Once the boats were identified, investigators started putting the day's events into chronological order. The earliest visual reference comes from a social media video displaying a time of approximately 3:23 p.m. A second video displays approximately 4:27 p.m. According to the information reviewed in the report, the Triton departed Horn Island at approximately 4:31 p.m. A shoreline photograph reportedly taken at 4:50 p.m. becomes the next major reference point. The report then incorporates statements describing activity around 5 p.m., a search planning coordinate documented at 6 p.m., and finally a witness statement describing observations made around 7:30 p.m. Piece by piece, investigators used those times to build the working timeline presented throughout the report. Once the timeline was in place, investigators compared the photographs. One of the changes they documented involved boat number 2, identified throughout the report as Frontier Bay. In earlier photographs, the boat appears anchored in one location, but by the time the 450 photograph was reportedly taken, it appears in a different position. Investigators also observed that boat X appears in one configuration of boats but is absent in another, documenting another change in the arrangement of vessels visible that afternoon. The report also notes that Nolan may possibly appear somewhere within the 450 photograph, although investigators were unable to make a positive identification from the image alone. Another section of the report focuses on the Triton and when it may have begun taking on water. The analysts reviewed the photographs, videos, and other materials included in their investigation, but were unable to determine when that occurred. To answer that question, they recommend collecting additional electronic records from the boat, including GPS info, engine data, bilge pump history, and onboard photographs and videos, along with interviews from everyone who was on board. The report then compares several public statements made after Nolan disappeared. Matthew Lamp described a group that was nearly involved in a fight around 5 p.m. Melissa Thomas later responded, saying she believed the person being described was someone else. The report includes both statements as investigators continue comparing witness accounts with the photographs and videos collected during the investigation. The final statement comes from Caitlin Brocard, not sure how to pronounce that, who wrote that her group remained in the area until approximately 7:30 p.m. before leaving and that Nolan was nowhere in sight. Near the end of the report, investigators identify the evidence they believe would help complete the timeline. That includes confirming Nolan's last independently corroborated sighting, authenticating the original video showing the 3:23 and 4:27 timestamp, identifying Boat X and everyone aboard, verifying the Triton's reported departure using electronic records, and creating a complete passenger list for each vessel so those accounts can be compared with the photographs, videos, and other digital evidence. One thing I found interesting is that the report ends almost the same way it begins. It comes back to the timeline. Investigators write that the period between Nolan's last independently corroborated sighting and the reported 4:31 departure remains the principal interval they're trying to reconstruct.
Not by local authorities, not by the state, not by anyone. And now, 2 witnesses who were on that island the day he disappeared have stepped forward with accounts that don't align with the story the public has been told. What they describe opens up a 3-hour window of time that nobody has been able to explain. And that window is the center of everything. If this is your first time hearing about Nolan Wells, stay with me, because by the time we get to the end of this, you are going to understand exactly why this case has captured the attention of an entire country. And if you've been following this story, I promise you there is detail here that most people scrolled right past. Make sure you are subscribed to Crime with Chris and drop a like on this video right now, because we are going to go deep and we are going to be precise. And this is exactly the kind of coverage this case deserves. Let's start from the beginning. Nolan Xavier Wells was born and raised on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. He attended Ocean Springs High School, where he played wide receiver on the football team. On National Signing Day in 2025, he committed to continue his football career at Southwest Mississippi Community College. He was not a statistic. He was not an abstraction. He was a young man with a sport he loved, a family that adored him, and an entire future lined up in front of him. His mother, Christine Wells Wansley, described him as a son who always showed up, always came home, and always said, "Yes, sir." His father, Elmore Wansley, raised him with a rule that his family says defined the way Nolan moved through the world. If you go with 5, you come back with 5. On the evening of July 3rd, 2026, Nolan cooked his family salmon for dinner. His mother described that final night at home as normal. A hug, a kiss, and then he was gone. He spent the night with friends, and the following morning, on the 4th of July, he joined a group headed out to Horn Island. Horn Island is a barrier island that sits roughly 10 miles off the coast of Mississippi, protected under the Gulf Islands National Seashore by the federal government. It is remote by design. There are no facilities on the island. There is no shelter, no communication infrastructure, and no means of contacting the outside world once you are there. Every year on the 4th of July, hundreds of boats crowd the waters around it. Families, friend groups, and boating parties anchor offshore and spend the day on the beach. It is a celebration. It is a tradition. And on July 4th, 2026, it was the last place Nolan Wells was seen alive. Nolan arrived on a boat called the Triton with a group of friends, most of whom he knew from school. According to accounts provided by multiple members of the group, the day was largely unremarkable up until the late afternoon. But somewhere between the last video taken at the gathering and the moment the Triton left the water, Nolan's friends say something changed. His friend Warren Hudson told officials that as the group prepared to leave, they begged Nolan to get back on the boat with them. Hudson said Nolan refused. He said Nolan told them he wanted to stay behind because he had met a girl and he wanted more time with her. Another friend, Trace Heston Shepard, echoed that account, saying Nolan genuinely seemed interested in the person he had met. A third friend, Javon Williams, offered something that cut in a different direction. Williams said it was not like Nolan to separate from the group he came with. GPS records confirmed by the United Cajun Navy's analytical report established that the Triton began moving at 4:31 in the afternoon. That departure is verified. Nolan was not on it. His father's words hang over everything that follows. If you go with 5, you come back with 5. According to officials, Nolan was reported missing on the night of July 4th, after he did not return from the island. An immediate multi-agency search was launched, involving the United States Coast Guard, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, and the National Park Service. On the morning of July 6th, a park ranger discovered Nolan's body in the water, near the northwestern tip of Horn Island. He had been in the Mississippi Gulf water for approximately 2 days. Dental records confirmed the identification. Nolan Wells was gone. What followed his death was something that almost never happens in a small county disappearance case. The story grew, the country paid attention, and the questions multiplied faster than the answers. Now, before we go any further, I want to introduce an organization that fundamentally changed what we know about the timeline of that day. The United Cajun Navy is a volunteer search and rescue organization that responds to natural disasters and missing person cases across the country. Following Nolan's disappearance, members of the organization began reviewing photographs, videos, GPS coordinates, social media posts, and public statements related to the events at Horn Island on July 4th. They worked to reconstruct the timeline of that day and compiled everything they found into a formal document. On July 31st, 2026, they released a 22-page analytical report titled Geospatial Timeline and Vessel Movement Analysis. That report was submitted to the Jackson County District Attorney, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, and to Nolan's parents directly. All parties confirmed receipt. Brian Trasher, the vice president and spokesperson for the United Cajun Navy, was explicit about what the report was and what it was not. He stated plainly that the report was not meant to point fingers or draw conclusions. It was an organized compilation of photographs, GPS data, social media statements, and public tips, assembled into a structured document that investigators could use. It is a civilian document. It is not an official law enforcement filing, but the details inside it are documented, organized, and important. The report opens by laying out the central questions the analysts were trying to answer. At what time did the key events happen? Which boats were present at Horn Island that afternoon? Which vessels moved and when? Who was aboard each one? When did the boat Nolan arrived on begin taking on water? And perhaps most critically, what happened between Nolan's last independently corroborated sighting and the confirmed 4:31 departure of the Triton? That last question is the one everything else orbits around. To build the timeline, analysts organized their evidence into 4 categories. The first was direct visual evidence, things that can actually be observed in a photograph or video, such as the boats, the shoreline, and the positioning of people and vessels. The second was analytical labeling. Throughout the report, each vessel was given a consistent identifier: boat number 1, boat number 2, boat number 3, boat X, the Palm Beach, and the Triton. Those labels allow an analyst to track the same vessel from one photograph to another and document any changes in position or presence over time. The third category was documentary evidence, including maps, GPS screenshots, emails, and social media posts. The fourth was analytical inference, the process of comparing multiple pieces of evidence to determine whether they support the same conclusion or contradict each other. Using those four categories, investigators began assembling the chronology of July 4th. The earliest visual reference comes from a social media video displaying a timestamp of approximately 3:23 in the afternoon. A second video displays a timestamp of approximately 4:27. GPS records confirm the Triton departed at 4:31. A shoreline photograph reportedly taken at 4:50 in the afternoon becomes the next documented reference point. The report then incorporates statements describing activity around 5 in the evening, a search planning coordinate documented at 6, and a witness account placing an observer at the scene until approximately 7:30 that night. Those timestamps become the bones of the entire investigation, and the gap between them is what demands explanation. The report notes that Nolan may possibly appear in the 4:50 photograph, but investigators were unable to make a positive identification from the image. The report also documents movement among several of the identified vessels between earlier photographs and the 4:50 image, with boat number 2, identified as Frontier Bay, appearing in a different position than it had been in earlier in the afternoon, and boat X appearing in one configuration and absent in another. One section of the report focuses specifically on the Triton and when it may have begun taking on water. Analysts reviewed all available photographs, videos, and materials, but were unable to determine when that occurred. The report recommends collecting additional electronic records from the vessel, including GPS data, engine logs, bilge pump history, and any photographs or videos stored on board, along with direct interviews from everyone who was aboard. Now, here is where the report shifts. Near the heart of the document, two names appear. Names that the United Cajun Navy notes most readers would likely scroll past without fully processing: Matthew Lamp and Caitlin Brochard. These are the two witnesses, and what each of them documented in separate accounts from separate positions on the water frames the 3-hour gap in a way that nothing else has. Matthew Lamp says he was on a boat near Horn Island on July 4th. According to his own Facebook posts, which were preserved in screenshots by at least 3 separate individuals, one of Lamp's passengers told him something troubling. That passenger said they were fairly certain Nolan Wells was part of a group that was almost in a physical confrontation at approximately 5 in the afternoon. Lamp wrote that the dispute appeared to be occurring among members of the same group, not with outside parties. He also noted that a blue-top Bertram boat departed the area noticeably fast following the incident. The conflict in that account is immediate and important. If the Triton left at 4:31, GPS confirmed, and Nolan's friends say he stayed behind voluntarily, then how was Nolan involved in a confrontation within the same social group at 5 o'clock? Was Lamp's passenger mistaken about the time? Were they mistaken about the identity of the person they saw? Or did something happen on or near that beach before the boat pulled away? Something the GPS record of the departure alone cannot reveal. Before accepting Lamp's account, it is critical to present exactly what the United Cajun Navy report itself says about it. The report classifies Lamp's statement as a low-confidence second-hand lead. The word second-hand matters. Lamp did not personally witness the confrontation. It was a passenger who told him about it. The timing has not been reconciled with the 4:31 GPS departure. And critically, Lamp's account was directly disputed by another witness on the water that same day. A woman named Melissa Thomas responded publicly to Lamp's post and said that was not Nolan Wells. She said the person Lamp's passenger described was a member of her own separate party, on a different boat. She also noted that when she had spoken with Nolan's group, one of the young men in the party was holding, in her words, an entire bottle of vodka in his hand. So which version is accurate? Did Lamp's passenger observe Nolan in a confrontation? Or did they see a completely different young man under circumstances that felt similar? That question has not been resolved. The United Cajun Navy's report notes the conflict, documents both accounts, and does not resolve the contradiction. That is the discipline this case needs. And it is exactly the kind of discipline we are going to apply to every claim in this coverage. Now, let's talk about Caitlin Brochard, because her account carries a different kind of weight. According to the United Cajun Navy's report, Brochard was anchored near the same cluster of boats where Nolan's group had been positioned earlier that afternoon. While she was there, she took a photograph. That photograph appears on page 12 of the report and shows 3 vessels anchored side by side, identified in the document as boat number 3, the Palm Beach, and the Triton. She was close enough to the scene to capture a clear image. She was present. She was watching. She was within visual range of the very location where Nolan's group had been. And when Brochard's group left the island at 7:30 that evening, she reported that Nolan Wells was nowhere in sight. Read that again, slowly. The Triton departs at 4:31 in the afternoon. Brochard stays. She is in the same area for 3 more hours. She is taking photographs. She is observing the boats. She is positioned within visual range of the location. And in those 3 hours, she never sees Nolan Wells. The United Cajun Navy noted that Brochard's statement functions as what they termed a negative observation, meaningful not for what she saw, but for what she did not. They also noted that fully evaluating her account requires confirming exactly where her vessel was positioned, what area of the shoreline was within her line of sight, how long she was continuously present, and whether she knew specifically who Nolan was and what he looked like. Those are the right questions to ask. But her account, even with those qualifications, stretches the documented absence of Nolan Wells from 4:31 in the afternoon all the way to 7:30 that evening. 3 hours. On a remote, uninhabited, federal barrier island, with no communication, no facilities, and no confirmed sightings of an 18-year-old who his friends say was waiting there voluntarily. The report names this absence directly. It calls it a material gap in the timeline. Those are not speculative words. A material gap is a documented absence of information covering a specific period of time. And Caitlin Brochard's statement is the evidence that stretches that gap further than anything previously documented. The central investigative question, stated plainly in the report, is this: what happened between Nolan's last independently corroborated sighting and the 4:31 departure of the Triton? And with Brochard's account now incorporated, that question has grown. What happened during those 3 hours? When was the last time anyone can independently confirm that Nolan Wells was alive, visible, and present on that island? As of the release of the United Cajun Navy's report, the answer to that question is not 4:30. It is not 5 o'clock. It is not 7:30. Nobody can answer it with verified, independent confirmation. And that uncertainty is what makes the autopsy findings so significant. The Wells family, represented by attorney Ben Crump, commissioned an independent autopsy because, in their words, the circumstances were not adding up, and they wanted an examination conducted by a physician with no ties to Mississippi. The independent autopsy was performed by Dr. Roger Mitchell, Jr., the president of the National Medical Association and the former chief medical examiner of Washington, D.C. The body was transported from Mississippi to Washington specifically for that purpose. The cost of the independent autopsy was covered by former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick. Dr. Mitchell's preliminary findings were released publicly on July 22, 2026, by Ben Crump at the NAACP National Convention in Chicago. The finding was as follows. The cause and manner of Nolan Wells's death have been listed as undetermined, pending investigation. That word, undetermined, is not a placeholder. It is a medical and legal position. It means the examining pathologist reviewed the available evidence and could not reach a conclusion sufficient to classify the death. Dr. Mitchell found no apparent lacerations, no fractures, and no deep tissue injuries visible at the time of examination. But he also stated explicitly that he could not rule out foul play. His report includes language noting that he could not determine whether any intervening non-natural factors contributed to or caused the death of Nolan Wells. There are documented reasons why Dr. Mitchell was unable to make a more definitive determination, and they are important to understand. First, Nolan's body had been in the Mississippi Gulf water for approximately 2 days before it was recovered. Decomposition at that stage can obscure bruising on the skin surface, a fact Dr. Mitchell's report acknowledged directly in the context of a second examination. Second, when Dr. Mitchell received the body, internal neck structures, including portions of the throat, were not present. They had been retained by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner during the first autopsy, which is a recognized standard practice in forensic pathology. However, their absence meant Dr. Mitchell could not directly examine the airway or the lungs for the presence of water. He could not examine the stomach contents, and he documented that he could not rule out injury to the neck as a contributing factor or cause of death. Third, the original toxicology results had not yet been received at the time of his examination. Dr. Mitchell did identify one finding that drew significant attention. He documented red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head. When independent forensic experts not connected to this case were asked to comment on that finding, they offered 3 possible explanations. The first was decompositional changes consistent with 2 days in warm water. The second was blunt force injury to the back of the head and neck. The third was livor mortis, the natural pooling of blood in soft tissue after death due to gravity. 3 possible explanations, no confirmed answer. The state's official autopsy was completed separately by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's office, but those results have been sealed. They have not been made public. According to reports, the official findings will remain under seal until the case is presented before a grand jury. Ben Crump has publicly called for Dr. Mitchell to be permitted to present his own independent findings before that same grand jury. This is the point where the 2 witnesses and the autopsy become inseparable. If the cause of death had been definitively ruled accidental drowning, the accounts of Matthew Lamp and Caitlin Brochard would be background detail. Interesting, but not essential. The autopsy changes that. When a cause of death is listed as undetermined, the timeline surrounding a person's final hours does not remain background detail. It becomes the foundation. Every confirmed sighting matters. Every documented absence matters. Every account from every person who was on or near that island during those 3 hours carries weight. And right now, Lamp and Brochard are holding 2 of the most significant pieces of that foundation. The United Cajun Navy's report does not end its analysis with the witness statements. It ends with a list of the evidence that investigators say would be necessary to complete the timeline. That list includes confirming Nolan's last independently corroborated sighting, authenticating the original videos showing the 3:23 and 4:27 timestamps, identifying Boat X and everyone aboard, verifying the Triton's reported departure using its own electronic records, and creating a complete passenger manifest for each vessel present that afternoon, so that those accounts can be compared against the photographs, videos, and digital evidence already collected. What the report does not say, and is careful not to say, is whether law enforcement has or has not gathered any of those materials. The report explicitly notes that its recommendations should not be interpreted as evidence that law enforcement either collected or failed to collect those items. That is an important distinction. What happens behind closed doors in an active investigation is not always visible to the public. But what is visible, what is documented and on record is this. Nolan's mother, Christine Wells Wansley, stated publicly at the July 22nd press conference that it was heartbreaking and concerning not to have heard from local authorities. She said the last time she had spoken to the sheriff's office was a day or two after Nolan's body was found on July 6th. That was over 2 weeks of silence before she made those words public. The official results of the state autopsy remain sealed, and the family continues waiting. This case has not unfolded in a quiet room. It has unfolded in front of millions of people on social media, and the attention has brought something dangerous with it. 3 individuals, a person from Illinois, a person from Ohio, and a person from California, were federally charged for threatening witnesses, a sitting judge, and local officials connected to the investigation. None of the 3 had any personal connection to Nolan, his family, or the boating group. They were strangers, swept up in online outrage, who crossed a line that landed them in federal custody. The FBI is actively investigating threats made against witnesses, their families, Nolan's parents, and public officials working on this case. The online environment surrounding this investigation has made things measurably harder, not easier, for the people who are trying to find the truth. That is the world this case is living in. And it is the reason that precision matters more here than anywhere else. So here is where we stand. A 22-page analytical report has documented a 3-hour window between Nolan's last independently corroborated sighting and the last reported observation of the area by a witness on the water. 2 people were present during portions of that window. One describes what his passenger believed was a near confrontation involving Nolan, an account the report classifies as low confidence and unverified. The other was anchored in the same stretch of water for 3 hours and says she never saw Nolan at all. The cause of death has been listed as undetermined. The official findings are sealed. The family has not heard from law enforcement in weeks, and the question that drives everything, what happened to Nolan Wells in those 3 hours on Horn Island, remains completely unanswered. We are just getting started. There is more evidence to work through, more timeline to examine, and more documented detail that the public has not fully absorbed. If you are watching this on Crime with Chris for the first time, subscribe right now so you do not miss part 2, because we are not stopping here. Hit the like button if this coverage matters to you, because it helps us keep going. Nolan Wells's family deserves a thorough, honest, factually grounded account of what happened to their son. And that is exactly what we are going to build, one documented detail at a time. Before we go any further, let's address something that cannot be ignored, because while investigators are working to answer questions about what happened on Horn Island on the 4th of July, a separate and deeply troubling situation has been unfolding around this case, one that is actively making the search for truth harder. 3 individuals, none of whom knew Nolan Wells, none of whom knew his family, and none of whom had any connection to the boating group on Horn Island that day, have been federally charged for threatening witnesses, a sitting judge, and local officials connected to this investigation. What they allegedly did was not advocacy. It was not justice. It was criminal, and it deserves to be treated as such. If you are watching Crime with Chris for the first time, stay right where you are, because what we are about to walk through is the most complete, factually grounded breakdown of where this case stands today that you are going to find anywhere. Subscribe to the channel right now so you do not miss a single update as this develops, and drop a like on this video. It takes 2 seconds, and it helps us keep going. Now let's get into it. Edward James Porter from Berwyn, Illinois, was federally charged with transmitting threatening communications after allegedly placing calls to 2 witnesses on July 31st and threatening to kill them and their families. According to the federal complaint, Porter told one of those witnesses that he knew their home address and then texted the address directly to them. He told another witness he would kill everyone present, including any police officers who showed up, and stated he planned to dismember a body and place it in a suitcase. Investigators were able to trace his calls through subpoenas served on his mobile carrier. A woman named Michelle Francine Edwards was charged after allegedly calling the George County Clerk's office 29 times and making bomb threats against the office during those calls. And a man identified in federal records as Joseph Alfredo Vasquez Dumars was charged with witness tampering after allegedly sending violent threats to Judge Ashley Cole, who is the stepmother of Nolan's friend Warren Hudson. Let that land for a moment. A sitting judge received federal-level violent threats because her stepson was present on a boat on the 4th of July. That judge had nothing to do with what happened on Horn Island. Her stepson has not been charged with a crime, and a stranger from California allegedly threatened her life anyway. Attorney Russell Latino, who represents members of the boating group, confirmed that Porter's alleged targets included 2 members of the family of Bart Edenston Jr., a 21-year-old University of Wyoming punter who was present on Horn Island on July 4th. One of those family members is a witness in the active investigation. They received murder and dismemberment threats from someone who found their phone number online. These arrests have absolutely nothing to do with what happened to Nolan Wells on Horn Island, but they have everything to do with why this case has become so volatile, so difficult to discuss clearly, and so dangerous for the people at the center of it. The online environment surrounding this investigation has been flooded with AI-generated photographs and videos that have circulated as though they are real. Unverified clips have been shared across social media platforms as evidence of an assault, when their authenticity has not been established by any law enforcement agency or credible investigative body. The atmosphere around this case is toxic, and that toxicity is not serving Nolan Wells. It is not serving his family. It is burying the real evidence underneath a mountain of noise. So let's cut through it right now. Here is what is documented and confirmed. 1. Nolan Wells traveled to Horn Island with a group of friends on July 4, 2026. 2. The boat he arrived on, the Triton, departed at 4:31 in the afternoon, confirmed by GPS records reviewed by the United Cajun Navy. 3. His friends have stated he chose to remain on the island voluntarily. 4. His body was found on the morning of July 6th at the northwestern tip of the island. 5. The independent autopsy, conducted by Dr. Roger Mitchell, Jr., lists the cause and manner of Nolan's death as undetermined pending investigation. 6. The state autopsy is complete but has been sealed, pending presentation to a grand jury. 7. A witness named Matthew Lamp reported a near confrontation at approximately 5 in the afternoon involving someone a passenger believed was Nolan, and that account has been directly disputed by another witness on the water that day. 8. A witness named Caitlin Brochard has stated she was anchored near the cluster of boats where Nolan's group had been, remained in that area until 7:30 in the evening, and that Nolan was nowhere in sight during that entire time. 9. 3 individuals with no connection to the case have been federally charged for threatening witnesses, a judge, and local officials. That is the foundation. Everything else being circulated on the internet right now is theory, and theory without a documented evidentiary basis is not something we deal in here. But here is what those 9 documented facts do not answer, and this is where this coverage earns its weight. The United Cajun Navy's report classifies the statements from both Matthew Lamp and Caitlin Brochard as documentary statements. That is a specific classification within their evidence hierarchy. It means their accounts exist in the form of text, either written correspondence or social media posts, and they sit below direct visual observation and below source-annotated evidence in terms of their standing within the investigation. They are useful for constructing hypotheses. They are useful for identifying leads, but they are not self-authenticating. A Facebook post is not the same as a sworn affidavit. A written statement shared through a civilian organization is not the same as testimony delivered under oath. So the real question here is not simply what these witnesses said. The real question is whether anyone has independently verified what they said. Has law enforcement interviewed the passenger aboard Lamp's boat who actually observed the alleged confrontation? Has anyone authenticated the metadata embedded in Brochard's photograph, the timestamp, the GPS coordinates, the camera identification? Has anyone pulled GPS records from Brochard's vessel to confirm she was anchored where and when she says she was? If the answer to those questions is yes, then these two witnesses may have fundamentally redefined the timeline of this investigation. If the answer is no, then everything built upon their statements is still resting on an unverified foundation. And that is exactly why this moment is so significant, because the difference between those two outcomes is enormous. Now, there is something that most people covering this story have not done, and I want to take the time to do it properly. There is a meaningful difference between what feels powerful on social media and what actually holds weight in a legal proceeding. This case is heading toward a grand jury. That is the stated direction. And inside that room, the question will not be what did Matthew Lamp post on Facebook. The question will be whether his account can withstand the specific scrutiny that criminal investigations demand. In formal investigative contexts, witness statements are evaluated according to 4 criteria: proximity, consistency, corroboration, and independence. Proximity means how physically close the witness was to the events they are describing. Consistency means whether their account has remained stable over time or shifted as the story evolved in public. Corroboration means whether any independent piece of evidence, a photograph, a GPS timestamp, another witness, supports the same version of events. And independence means whether the witness has any personal connection to the parties involved that could influence the way they have characterized what they observed. Apply those 4 criteria to Matthew Lamp. His proximity is indirect. He was not the person who observed the alleged confrontation. A passenger aboard his boat was. That makes his account secondhand at minimum. And in most legal contexts, it constitutes hearsay, a statement filtered through another person's memory on a crowded holiday weekend, surrounded by boats, music, alcohol, and strangers. His consistency is difficult to evaluate because his original statement was a social media post, not a recorded interview. And his corroboration is actively weak because another witness, Melissa Thomas, directly contradicted his passenger's identification and stated the person they saw was not Nolan Wells at all, but someone from her own separate party on a different vessel entirely. None of that means Lamp is being dishonest. It means that as his account currently stands, without independent verification of the passenger's observation and without any photographic or digital evidence from the 5 o'clock window, it would carry very limited weight before a grand jury. The United Cajun Navy's own report classified it accordingly, a low-confidence second-hand lead, and noted that the timing has not been reconciled with the 4:31 GPS departure of the Triton. Now apply those same 4 criteria to Caitlin Brochard, and notice how the picture shifts. Brochard's proximity is direct. She is not relaying someone else's account. She is saying she was physically present, anchored near the same cluster of boats where Nolan's group had been positioned, for 3 hours after the Triton departed. Her consistency, as far as public reporting indicates, has not changed. The statement documented in the United Cajun Navy's report matches what she reportedly communicated. Her corroboration includes at least 1 photograph, appearing on page 12 of the report, showing 3 vessels anchored side by side at or near the relevant location. If investigators are able to authenticate the metadata within that image, extracting the embedded timestamp and GPS coordinates from the file itself, that photograph transitions from a documentary lead into corroborated physical evidence. And her independence is notable. As far as public reporting shows, Brochard has no known connection to Nolan Wells, his family, or any member of the boating group. By every investigative measure, Brochard's account is structurally stronger than Lamp's, not because it tells a more dramatic story, not because it is more emotionally compelling, but because it satisfies more of the actual criteria that determine whether a witness statement survives scrutiny. And her account raises a question that, as of today, no one has been able to answer. Horn Island's western tip is not an expansive terrain. It is a narrow strip of sand. From one side you can see across to the other. If an 18-year-old man was present on that beach, walking, swimming, sitting, waiting for someone to come back for him, a person anchored nearby for 3 consecutive hours would see him, unless he was not there anymore. And that sentence is the one that pulls everything else into focus. Because if Nolan was not visible on that beach for 3 hours, there are only a limited number of explanations. Either he left the island on another boat that has not yet been identified, or he entered the water, whether voluntarily or otherwise, before Brochard arrived or shortly after, and was already beyond the point of being seen from a vessel anchored at the shoreline. Or something happened to him that removed him from plain sight entirely. Each of those possibilities leads somewhere different, and not one of them has been confirmed or eliminated. Here is why the autopsy findings make the timeline so much more critical than they would be in any other kind of case. Drowning, as a cause of death, is not confirmed through a single test or a single physical finding. It is a diagnosis of exclusion. You determine that someone drowned by ruling out every other possibility. No evidence of trauma, no relevant toxicological findings, no underlying medical condition, no indicators of restraint or assault. Only when all other causes have been excluded does drowning become the standing conclusion. But Dr. Roger Mitchell could not exclude everything else. The internal neck structures were not present when he received the body. He could not examine the airway. He could not evaluate the lungs for the presence of water. He found red discoloration at the back of the head that 3 independent forensic experts could not agree upon, offering 3 separate possible explanations, none of which could be confirmed or dismissed from what was available to him. Decomposition had advanced to the point where surface examination was unreliable. The toxicology results had not been received at the time of his examination. That is not a failure of the process. That is the process encountering the conditions that 2 days in warm Gulf water produce. But it means the state's autopsy, the one conducted by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner, the one that presumably had access to those retained neck structures and the complete original examination, becomes the controlling document in this case. And that document is sealed. The public does not have access to it. The family does not have access to it. It will not be released until it is presented before a grand jury, and no date for that grand jury presentation has been publicly announced. This means the people closest to Nolan Wells, the people trying to understand what happened to their son, are operating with a fraction of the available information. They have an independent autopsy that says undetermined. They do not know whether the state autopsy agrees with that conclusion or contradicts it. They do not know whether state examiners found something that Dr. Mitchell was unable to find. They do not know if the 2 documents align or stand in direct opposition. Everything hangs in suspension, except the witness accounts. Those exist right now. They are documented. They have been submitted to the district attorney and the sheriff's office, and they create a specific obligation for investigators that did not exist before the United Cajun Navy published its report. Because if Brochard was anchored near those boats from the time the Triton departed until 7:30 that evening, and never saw Nolan Wells, investigators have to answer a question that cannot be deferred or dismissed. Where was he? Not where might he have been, not what could have happened. Where was he? Confirmed, verified, and documented. The United Cajun Navy's report makes a recommendation that speaks directly to this. It recommends that investigators obtain cell tower records and GPS data from all vessels known to have been in the area between 4 in the afternoon and 8 in the evening on July 4th. Not only the Triton, not only the vessels already identified, but every boat in that window, because cell tower data carries a specific kind of evidentiary weight. It can establish which phones were within range of the island and during what periods. It can show when a device arrived in range and when it stopped pinging. Nolan's phone was never recovered, but the carrier records for that device represent the only remaining way to reconstruct his digital footprint after his friends departed. If his phone was still registering a signal near Horn Island at 5 or 6:30 that evening, that changes the shape of the entire investigation. If his phone stopped pinging at or around 4:31, that tells a very different story. Whether that data has been requested and reviewed is not publicly known. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office has not disclosed what evidence has been collected, what subpoenas have been issued, or what leads have been followed. That silence is legally appropriate in an active investigation, but it is also part of what is driving the family's frustration and the public's. Christine Wells Wansley and Elmore Wansley buried their 18-year-old son. He had just graduated high school. He was supposed to be starting a new chapter of his life. His mother stood at a podium in Chicago, next to Ben Crump, in front of a national audience, and what she asked for was not dramatic, and it was not complicated. She asked for transparency. She asked for answers. She asked for her son to be treated with the same urgency and care that any parent in this country would want for their child. Christine Wells Wansley stated publicly that it was heartbreaking and concerning not to have heard from local authorities, and that the last time she spoke directly with the sheriff's office was a day or two after Nolan's body was found on July 6th. Those are her words, delivered at a nationally covered press conference. In a case of this magnitude, with this many documented unanswered questions, that communication gap does not build public confidence, it erodes it. Ben Crump, representing the family, has made several specific public requests. He has called for the state autopsy results to be unsealed and made available to the family. He has called for Dr. Mitchell to be permitted to present his independent findings before the grand jury. He has called for a federal review of the investigation, and he has drawn explicit comparisons to other cases involving young black men in the South where the investigative process moved slowly, or not at all, and where the families were left without answers for months or years. Whether you agree with that framing or not, the underlying demand is not unreasonable. A family wants to know what happened to their child. That is not a political position. That is the bare minimum. But fairness in this coverage also requires something that many people following this story online have not extended to others at the center of it. Warren Hudson has not been charged with a crime. Bart Edmston Jr. has not been charged with a crime. The other young men who were on that boat have not been named as suspects by any law enforcement agency. They are witnesses, and as witnesses, they and their families have been subjected to threats of murder, threats of dismemberment, and relentless online harassment from strangers who have decided guilt without a single piece of verified legal evidence. Warren Hudson's stepmother, a sitting judge, required federal intervention after receiving violent threats. Bart Edmston Jr.'s family members had their personal contact information distributed publicly by someone in Illinois who had never met any of them. Russell Latino, the attorney representing members of the boating group, has stated that his clients cooperated with investigators from the beginning, provided statements, and has pointed to the GPS data as consistent with the timeline his clients described. Latino has not publicly addressed the specific gap created by Brochard's account. He has not explained why a witness who was anchored in that area for 3 hours never observed Nolan on the beach, but he also has not been asked that question in any formal legal setting. And until he is, noting the absence of an explanation is appropriate. Filling that absence with assumption is not. Go back to page 12 of the United Cajun Navy report. Brochard's photograph. 3 boats, anchored side by side. It is not just an image. It is a piece of physical evidence with embedded data, a timestamp, GPS coordinates, camera identification. If that metadata is authenticated by investigators, her statement stops being a documentary lead. It becomes corroborated testimony from an independent witness with no known stake in the outcome. and corroborated independent testimony from someone present for 3 hours after the group departed is the kind of evidence that does not get explained away easily. It does not tell us what happened to Nolan Wells, but it tells us where he was not. And in a death investigation with a 3-hour undocumented gap, knowing where someone was not is often the first step toward establishing where they were. Here is where this case stands today, stated plainly and completely. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office investigation is active and open. The state autopsy is complete and sealed, pending grand jury proceedings. No date for grand jury presentation has been publicly announced. The independent autopsy lists cause and manner of death as undetermined. No criminal charges have been filed in connection with Nolan's death. 3 individuals unconnected to the case have been federally charged for threatening witnesses, a judge, and public officials. The United Cajun Navy's 22-page report has been formally submitted to the district attorney and the sheriff's office. 2 witnesses have placed themselves at or near Horn Island during the 3-hour window between the Triton's departure and sundown, and neither account has been publicly verified or publicly contradicted by law enforcement. In Moss Point and across the Mississippi Gulf Coast, community members have held vigils for Nolan. His family has asked supporters to wear white in his memory. Supporters have rallied around the family financially and publicly, and every week, the pressure on local officials to provide answers continues to grow. But pressure is not evidence. Outrage is not a verdict. Justice does not operate on the timeline of a social media cycle. It is a process, slow, deliberate, frustrating, and in this case, not yet fully underway. Because until a grand jury hears the complete evidence, until the state autopsy is unsealed, until investigators can formally answer the question of where Nolan Wells was between 4:30 to 1 and 7:30 on July 4th, 2026, the case remains open. The gap remains undocumented, and a mother is still waiting. Christine Wells Wansley said something at that press conference in Chicago that is difficult to set aside. She said she just wants to know what happened to her baby, not what the internet decided happened, not what theories people built from unverified videos. What actually happened? The facts, the evidence, the documented truth. That is not an extraordinary request. That is the minimum that any parent deserves when their child does not come home. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. He loved football. He had just graduated. He went to an island with people he trusted on a summer holiday, and he never came home. The question that has driven every minute of this coverage is not how he died. It is when was the last time anyone can independently confirm that he was alive and on that island. As of today, that question does not have a verified answer, and until it does, this case is not closed. It is not resolved. It is wide open. We will keep following every development until there are real answers. That is what this channel is here for. If this case matters to you, if the work of cutting through the noise and building something accurate and responsible matters to you, subscribe to Crime with Chris right now and hit the notification bell so you are here the moment something breaks. Drop a like on this video if you believe Nolan Wells' story deserves to be told with precision and care. And leave a comment below with the one detail from Brochard's account or Lamp's account that stands out most to you. Because sometimes the thread that doesn't add up for a viewer is the exact thread an investigator is already pulling. Every question matters in a case like this. Until there are answers, we keep asking.